On a spring morning at Lake Tahoe, it's the perfect time for a scenic flight. The golden rays of the sun cast a shimmering glow over the lake, turning the water into a giant mirror. Excited tourists gather at the small regional airport, eager to board the Cessna 208 Caravan for a short yet extraordinary flight that promises breathtaking views of the stunning landscape. The air is filled with anticipation as the passengers board the plane. Among them is Captain Emily Carson, a Navy pilot who dresses modestly in a sweatshirt adorned with the Navy insignia. Her outfit is simple, paired with jeans and a baseball cap. She doesn't seek attention, but her presence carries a quiet confidence. Emily's sharp brown eyes and neatly tied back brown hair speak of her discipline, but she has no interest in drawing attention. Today, she just wants to enjoy the flight as part of the everyday simplicity of life. Seated next to Emily is Daniel Ford, a wealthy businessman dressed in an expensive suit. His eyes glance at her from time to time, sizing her up. In his eyes, Emily doesn't belong here. She's just an administrative assistant, perhaps someone benefiting from a free ride because of a connection with someone in the military. He can't comprehend why someone like her would be on this flight, amongst ordinary tourists. "Don't tell me you're just here for the view?" Daniel asks condescendingly, a slight smile playing on his lips, though his tone reflects judgment. He assumes she's out of place, his thoughts clouded by preconceived notions. Emily doesn't respond immediately. She simply offers a calm, polite smile. She's used to being misunderstood by those who don't know her world, a world that's far beyond the scope of people like Daniel, who never experienced the grit and demands of military life. "Yes, just here for the views," Emily responds with a composed tone, her voice steady and unaffected by his remarks. The flight takes off smoothly, gliding over the breathtaking scenery of Lake Tahoe. The sky is a crisp blue, and the water below sparkles in the sunlight. The landscape is a perfect mixture of towering mountains and lush forests, with the lake reflecting the mountains in its pristine surface. The passengers are quietly absorbed in the grandeur of the view, feeling a sense of wonder as the plane climbs higher into the sky. However, Daniel's attitude remains unchanged. He continues to eye Emily with skepticism, his mind still filled with doubts about her role here. He wonders if she even knows how to fly. To him, people like her, women in uniform, are often underestimated. He can't fathom that someone like Emily might be an expert pilot, let alone a Navy officer with years of experience behind the controls of fighter jets. The quiet hum of the engines is interrupted only by the soft conversations of the passengers. Emily, however, remains calm and introspective. Her gaze is focused on the vast expanse of nature outside her window, but her thoughts are clear. She isn't bothered by Daniel's judgments or anyone else's. This flight is her moment of peace, a brief escape from the complexities of her military career and the world that often undervalues women in leadership roles. The plane soars above the clouds, passing over gentle hills and deep green forests, and as the minutes pass, the beauty of the landscape becomes even more vivid. The snowy peaks of distant mountains seem to stretch endlessly into the sky. This is the moment when all passengers, regardless of who they are, feel a sense of serenity as the aircraft continues its path through the clear, crisp air. But the calm doesn't last long. The plane's peaceful journey will soon be disrupted by a violent storm, a storm none of the passengers are prepared for, and one that will thrust them into a life-or-death situation that none of them could have predicted. As the Cessna continued its path across Lake Tahoe, the tranquility of the flight was suddenly pierced by an unsettling shift in the air. The once clear sky began to darken, and the weather, which had seemed perfect moments ago, began to deteriorate rapidly. The temperature dropped, and the winds, once gentle, started to whip with increasing intensity. The passengers, still blissfully unaware, remained in their seats, some distracted by the views and others lost in their thoughts. However, Captain Emily Carson, who had been keeping a quiet eye on the horizon, sensed the change before anyone else. Her years of experience flying through all types of conditions had honed her instincts, and she could tell that something was off. She quickly scanned the cockpit, checking the instruments to ensure everything was still functioning as it should. Her brow furrowed slightly as she glanced out the window again. The first flashes of dark clouds were beginning to gather in the distance, rapidly moving in their direction. Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts. The co-pilot's voice came over the intercom, but there was an edge of urgency to it now. We're encountering some turbulence ahead, so please remain seated. Most passengers reacted with mild confusion at first, looking around and murmuring to each other. Turbulence was common on flights, but this felt different. The plane seemed to shudder slightly as it began to climb, adjusting to the shift in the air currents. Outside the windows, the clouds had begun to churn ominously, swirling in darker shades of gray. Emily's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on the controls. She exchanged a quick glance with the co-pilot, who looked visibly concerned. "We need to turn back," the co-pilot muttered, but Emily shook her head. Turning back would only delay the inevitable. "No," she said firmly. "We'll make it through. Just need to keep steady." She steadied the plane as best as she could, but the turbulence continued to worsen. The seatbelt sign flashed brightly, and passengers began to stir uneasily, their calm expressions shifting to concern. Daniel Ford, who had been resting his arms across his chest, suddenly sat up straighter in his seat, his eyes wide. He glanced out the window as the sky darkened more, his earlier confidence beginning to waver. "What's going on?" he asked aloud, his voice edged with a hint of panic. Emily didn't respond, her focus on the instruments and the storm that was quickly surrounding them. It wasn't just turbulence now. There was a distinct rumble of thunder in the distance, growing louder by the second. Emily's eyes flicked to the radar. She could see it coming. The storm was bigger than she had anticipated. She felt her pulse quicken, but knew there was no time for panic. "Everyone, brace yourselves," the captain's voice came over the intercom, but it was clear to everyone on board that they were in for something far more dangerous than just a bumpy ride. Suddenly, a loud crack of thunder shook the plane, and a flash of blinding light streaked across the sky, followed immediately by a deafening boom. A lightning bolt struck the plane with an explosive force, the entire cabin vibrating violently. The passengers screamed in shock, and the plane pitched sharply downward, causing a few of them to lose their grip on their seats. The plane's systems flickered, lights dimmed, and the engines sputtered for a terrifying moment. The plane was being battered by nature's fury, and the damage was evident. Emily's heart raced, but her face remained calm, composed. This was her moment. She immediately grabbed the controls with both hands, her eyes scanning the cockpit's emergency systems, reading the flashing red lights. The co-pilot was silent now, his face pale as he checked the radar. They were losing altitude at a rapid pace. "Stay with me," Emily muttered to herself as she fought to regain control. She could feel the heavy weight of the storm pressing against the plane, the turbulence now almost violent as the aircraft plummeted in a dive. The wind howled around them, and every inch of the plane seemed to groan under the pressure. The systems were failing, and the engines sounded as though they might give out at any moment. "Mayday, mayday, this is Cessna 208. Emily's voice was calm but firm as she keyed the microphone to contact air traffic control. "We've been struck by lightning. Critical systems damaged. Need emergency landing instructions." She paused for a brief moment as the crackling static came through the speakers. The control tower's response was quick, but their instructions were muddled, the signals weak due to the storm. "Copy, Cessna 208. You are descending rapidly. Maintain control. Proceed to Carson City Municipal. Emergency teams are being alerted. We will guide you in." Emily's hands tightened on the controls as she fought to level the plane. The nose of the aircraft was still dipping at a dangerous angle, and the clouds outside seemed to swirl and churn with every passing second. The sky was black, and the only light came from the occasional flash of lightning. Daniel was gripping the armrest beside him. His earlier bravado completely vanished. His heart was in his throat, and he could barely breathe as the reality of their situation set in. His eyes flicked over to Emily, who was focused entirely on the task at hand. For the first time, he saw her not as an inconvenience or someone who didn't belong, but as someone who was fully in control. The plane shook again as another gust of wind hit, and Daniel's stomach lurched. He glanced around at the other passengers, many of whom were now clutching their seat belts or praying quietly. But Emily didn't falter. With every movement of her hands, she stabilized the aircraft a little more, guiding it through the fierce storm. "Emily, what can we do to help?" a passenger asked shakily from the row behind her. Her voice was steady as she responded, "Just stay calm and keep your seatbelts fastened. We'll be fine. I've got this." As the storm continued to batter them, Emily's skill and focus became more apparent with every second that passed. She fought the plane's descent, pulling back on the yoke, battling not just the elements, but the weight of everyone's fear. The storm raged on outside, but Emily was determined to get them through it. They weren't out of danger yet, but she would bring them down safely, no matter the cost. The storm outside the Cessna 208 howled relentlessly, its fury seeming to intensify with every passing second. Inside the cockpit, Emily Carson fought against the increasingly volatile air currents as the plane's wings bucked and shuddered under the pressure. The storm had descended upon them so quickly that even the most seasoned pilots would have struggled to keep control. But Emily, with years of military experience and countless hours in the sky, remained unwavering. "Emily, the co-pilot's voice cracked through the chaos, his words lost in the next roar of turbulence. He grabbed the back of his seat as the plane dipped sharply again, the altimeter spinning wildly. The cabin around them was in pandemonium, passengers gripping their seats, their faces twisted in fear. The once calm sightseeing flight had turned into a nightmare. Emily's brow furrowed as she checked the flight instruments once more. They were losing altitude fast. The lightning strike had taken its toll. One of the primary systems had failed, leaving them without proper engine diagnostics. With her heart racing, Emily knew the plane's fuel supply was not the only thing at risk. If they didn't regain control quickly, they'd crash. Her breath came in steady, measured gasps, her mind racing through protocols and emergency procedures. There was no time for hesitation. Every second counted. And then, the co-pilot slumped over in his seat. Emily's eyes widened for just a moment, a pang of shock running through her veins. She reached over and shook him, but he didn't respond. A quick scan told her all she needed to know. He'd been knocked unconscious from the lightning strike and the intense turbulence. The situation had just gone from dire to catastrophic. Now, it was all on her. With no time to waste, Emily moved into action. She unstrapped herself, pushing past the sheer panic that threatened to paralyze her. As she slid into the pilot's seat, her movements were swift, decisive, instinctive. She flicked switches, adjusted controls, and spoke into the radio, her calm voice cutting through the static. "This is Captain Emily Carson. I have taken control of the aircraft. We are heading for an emergency landing. Please advise." The radio crackled, and the voice of air traffic control came through, strained by interference. "Copy that, Cessna 208. We are rerouting you to Carson City Municipal. Emergency crews are on standby. Stay with us." Emily nodded, though she knew they couldn't afford any more distractions. Her hands gripped the yoke tightly as she leveled the plane out, slowly regaining a semblance of control. But the storm wasn't letting up. The wind shrieked, the rain pounded, and the plane bucked violently under her guidance. Every inch of the craft seemed to protest, but Emily, breathing deeply, held steady. She had been trained for moments like this, though she had never imagined she'd be fighting this battle alone. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, their collective fear hanging in the air like an oppressive weight. They had no idea who she was, but they had to trust her now. She was their only hope. Her military training, her entire career, everything she had worked for, was coming to the forefront in this critical moment. She wasn't just a pilot. She wasn't just a woman in uniform. She was their lifeline. A sudden, violent shake rattled the plane, sending a wave of panic through the cabin. Several passengers screamed. The businessman, Daniel Ford, had been silently clutching his armrest throughout the ordeal, his face pale and sweating. He could no longer sit idly by. His earlier doubts about Emily were vanishing, replaced by a gnawing fear that his life, along with everyone else's, was in her hands. "What's happening?" Daniel shouted, his voice cracking, his usual composed exterior now shattered by terror. Emily didn't look at him. She couldn't. Not now. Her mind was focused entirely on the task at hand. She knew what had to be done. She could hear the groaning of the wings as they continued to battle the storm's might. The controls, now partially damaged, felt stiff beneath her fingers. The storm had taken its toll on the hydraulics, but Emily wasn't about to give up. Not when they were so close to the airport. "Everyone, stay calm." Emily's voice came through the intercom, loud and clear. "We're heading for an emergency landing. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We'll be on the ground soon." The calm authority in her voice seemed to bring a sliver of hope to the frightened passengers. Her confidence was a beacon in the storm, literally. But Emily knew that they weren't out of danger yet. They were descending rapidly, and Carson City Municipal was still miles away, buried beneath layers of dark clouds and stormy winds. They were still at the mercy of the storm, and she needed to act fast. With a deep breath, Emily adjusted the plane's course, steering it toward the runway, relying on the faint, glitchy signals from the control tower to guide her. The rain continued to pour, and the turbulence didn't relent, but she fought to stabilize the aircraft, inch by inch. Her every muscle was tense, every thought focused on the next step. There was no room for error. One wrong move, and they wouldn't make it. A sharp bolt of lightning flashed in front of the cockpit window, blinding her momentarily. The plane jerked violently as a gust of wind slammed into them from the side, and Emily felt the plane drop again, its nose diving. She gritted her teeth and pulled the yoke back with all her strength, fighting against the pull of the wind. The plane's descent slowed, just enough for her to regain control. Behind her, Daniel Ford was frozen, unable to look away from the woman at the helm. His earlier arrogance had completely evaporated. He had seen firsthand what it meant to underestimate someone. He had judged Emily based on nothing more than her appearance, and now, he realized just how wrong he had been. Emily didn't have time to think about that. She had a plane to land, and that was all that mattered. Her fingers danced over the controls with practiced ease, navigating through the storm as though it were just another routine mission. But this wasn't routine. This was life or death. "Almost there," she muttered to herself, as the rain continued to hammer against the windows. The runway was just ahead, though the visibility was practically zero. Emily's heart beat faster as she began the final descent, knowing that one mistake could end it all. But there was no room for mistakes now. She would land this plane, no matter what. The storm had enveloped the Cessna 208 entirely now, as though the sky itself was conspiring against Emily. The rain, falling in sheets, pounded relentlessly against the plane's fuselage, obscuring her already limited visibility. The wind screeched as it slammed into the aircraft from all directions, shaking it violently. It felt as if the very air around them had turned into a turbulent, invisible force, determined to tear the plane apart. But Emily remained resolute. The experience that had taken her through countless missions, where every second counted, kicked in. The hours spent training under pressure, the countless nights in simulated storms, all seemed to culminate in this one moment. This was no longer just a routine flight. This was a fight for survival, and she was determined to win. Her eyes darted across the cockpit, reading the instruments with the precision of someone who had flown through far worse. The plane's altimeter was showing a rapid descent, but she couldn't afford to focus on that right now. She needed to maintain control. Slowly, methodically, she adjusted the throttle and fought to keep the wings level. The gusts of wind were pushing the plane off course, but Emily wasn't about to let them dictate her flight path. The radio crackled again, the voice of the air traffic controller barely audible over the static. "Cessna 208, do you copy? You're cleared for final approach to Carson City. Maintain heading, and we'll guide you in." Emily's hands tightened on the yoke. "Copy that, Carson City." "I'm coming in," she replied, her voice steady but laced with the underlying tension that even she couldn't hide. Every movement she made was calculated, her thoughts clear despite the chaos around her. The storm was trying to drag them down, but she was stronger. Outside, lightning cracked across the sky once more, a blinding flash that illuminated the pitch-black clouds for just a fraction of a second. In that fleeting moment, she could see how close they were to the ground, how low they were now, but still, the runway was out of sight. The final approach to Carson City Municipal was shrouded in thick clouds and rain. The co-pilot remained unconscious in the seat beside her, and Emily knew there was no help coming from that direction. Daniel Ford, sitting in the back, had not said a word in what felt like hours. He was clearly shaken, his previous arrogance and dismissiveness replaced with a profound sense of vulnerability. The other passengers, too, were holding their breath, clutching their armrests, praying for the storm to end. But Emily knew that the storm would not end on its own. She would have to force it to. The control tower's voice came through again, garbled by the static, but still clear enough to hear. Cessna 208, you're 5 miles from the runway. Prepare for landing. We are guiding you in. Emily's breath caught in her throat. 5 miles. The distance between life and death. The last stretch of their journey, and the hardest part. They had been descending steadily, but they still needed to level out, still needed to glide toward the runway. And with every gust of wind, every tremor in the plane's body, Emily felt the weight of that responsibility. She wasn't just fighting for her own survival. She was fighting for every person aboard. With no time to waste, she steadied the plane once more, adjusting the rudder to counter the sudden shifts in direction. The turbulence was relentless. The aircraft bucked under her control, a violent reminder that nothing was guaranteed. There was no way to know whether the landing gear would deploy correctly or whether the runway would even be visible in time. The storm, in all its fury, didn't care. It didn't care about her skill, her training, or her resolve. But Emily, despite everything, refused to surrender. Her fingers flew across the controls, adjusting speed and altitude, keeping the plane on track. In the back of her mind, she could hear the control tower's instructions clearly, but they felt distant, almost irrelevant compared to the task at hand. Daniel Ford, who had been silent for so long, couldn't hold back his fear any longer. His voice cracked as he called out, "What do you need me to do? How can I help?" His usual composure was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate need for reassurance. Emily's gaze flickered to him for the briefest moment before she returned her attention to the sky ahead. "Keep calm. We're almost there," she said, her voice even. She didn't have the luxury of comforting him. She needed to focus. The plane lurched again, and her stomach twisted as the descent steepened once more. The plane had just dipped below the clouds when Emily saw it. Through the torrential rain, barely visible at first, but unmistakable, the runway. It stretched out before her like a lifeline. Her heart skipped a beat, but she couldn't let up. Not now. "Final approach," she murmured to herself, knowing she still had 1,000 decisions to make in the next few minutes. She had no idea what the runway conditions would be like, but she could already see the dim outline of the emergency vehicles stationed at the edge, their lights flashing through the rain. Carson City was ready for them. Another violent gust of wind nearly tore the plane off course. Emily reacted instinctively, her hands pulling the yoke in the opposite direction, her body leaning into the movement. Sweat ran down her face, but her eyes remained fixed on the runway. The rain was now coming down in sheets, the windshield wipers barely keeping up. The storm was relentless, but Emily was undeterred. With the runway in sight, she made a last-minute adjustment to the landing gear, praying that everything would hold. She steadied her breathing, took one final glance at the instruments, and then it was time. Her hands moved with surgical precision, guiding the plane lower, closer. The turbulence continued to batter the Cessna, but Emily held the yoke steady, her body coiled like a spring. The sound of the wind, the crash of the rain against the fuselage, and the thrum of the engines were all drowned out by the single thought in her mind: land the plane. She had come this far, and she wasn't about to fail now. As the plane descended, Emily's fingers gripped the throttle one last time. The moment was now. The runway was inches away, and with a final, swift movement, she leveled the aircraft out. She was ready to land. The rain came down in a relentless, pounding sheet, obscuring the landscape outside the cockpit. It blurred the edges of the world, turning the dark expanse into a chaotic mess of water and wind. But Emily Carson's focus was laser-sharp. The plane had been descending steadily, the steady rumble of its engines cutting through the cacophony of the storm. Carson City Municipal Airport loomed just ahead, but the challenges were far from over. The runway, though now visible, was only a faint outline against the heavy storm clouds. It was a dangerous and uncertain final approach, but Emily was determined. There was no turning back. "You're doing great, Emily," the voice of the air traffic controller crackled through the static, the words almost drowned out by the storm's fury. "Just keep your heading. The runway is just a few miles out. You've got this." The reassurance was there, but Emily didn't need it. She had been trained for situations like this. Her training, her instincts, everything she had endured during her years in the Air Force had prepared her for this moment. But even with all that, there was still the unsettling truth. She was on her own. She was the one flying the plane. She was the one who had to bring it home. As the plane sliced through the turbulent air, Emily's hands gripped the controls with a strength born of years of practice. Her heart raced, but her mind remained calm, the endless hours of flying through harsh conditions coming to her aid in this life-and-death moment. The thought of the lives she was responsible for, the passengers, the crew, everyone aboard, fueled her determination. She couldn't let them down, not when they were so close. The businessman, Daniel Ford, who had been quiet for what felt like an eternity, now looked up from his seat. He had been watching Emily's every move with a mixture of awe and disbelief. His once derisive attitude had long since evaporated, replaced with something akin to fear. He had witnessed the storm tearing at the plane, and now he watched Emily work with a calmness that seemed otherworldly. His hands, previously clasped tightly in his lap, now gripped the edge of his seat. The flight was no longer a joke, no longer something he could write off with a sneer. He had seen enough. The woman at the helm wasn't just any pilot. She was a professional, and she was saving their lives. Emily's eyes flicked from the instruments in front of her to the radar screen, where the outline of Carson City Municipal Airport was appearing more clearly with every second. The storm, however, showed no sign of letting up. Every gust of wind threatened to send the plane spiraling off course, each drop of rain cutting through the air like a blade, hitting the windshield with a deafening thud. But Emily's mind was quiet. She wasn't listening to the noise or feeling the fear that everyone else around her was drowning in. She was focused on one thing: landing the plane. "Stay with me, just a little longer," she whispered under her breath, as if speaking to the plane itself. Her fingers worked in harmony with the flight systems, adjusting altitude, speed, and trajectory as she prepared for the final descent. The plane was still responding, though its control systems were damaged. The longer they flew, the more the systems would degrade. Every second counted. The final approach was nothing short of treacherous. Emily had to make a critical adjustment, turning the plane into the storm's path to align it properly with the runway. Her stomach lurched as a gust of wind hit them broadside, pushing the plane toward the edge of the sky. Her body tensed in response, and she countered the movement instinctively, pulling back on the controls to steady the descent. She glanced at the altimeter once more. They were at 2,000 feet, too high to be landing yet, but every moment brought them closer to the ground, closer to Carson City. Come on," she muttered to herself. Almost there. The distance between them and the runway was closing quickly, and with every passing second, the storm only seemed to intensify. Lightning struck again, so close that Emily could feel the air vibrate with its power. The storm wasn't giving up, but neither was she. The control tower's voice came through once more, urging her onward, but she barely heard it. Her attention was solely on the aircraft, on the people in the cabin, and on the fragile thread of control that kept them all alive. She was within moments of making the most important decision of her life. Then, as if to taunt her resolve, the plane's fuel gauge blinked, its warning light flashing bright red. A punch of adrenaline shot through her chest, but Emily refused to let panic seep in. She had prepared for this. The fuel would hold for just a little longer. She had enough to land safely. Focus. She had to focus. 5 miles. 4 miles. 3 miles. The runway stretched out before her now, the end of her descent in sight. But she was still too high. If she didn't act now, she would miss the runway entirely. Emily slammed her hand down on the throttle, cutting power to the engines to allow the plane to fall faster. Every ounce of energy in her body seemed to go into controlling the aircraft as the ground rushed toward them. This was the final push, the most critical moment. "Come on," she breathed, her voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. As if the storm itself had granted her one final gift, the rain lightened for a moment, and through the haze, the glow of runway lights appeared ahead. She had her line. Her hands moved faster than ever, making the last-minute corrections needed to keep them on track. At just under 1,000 feet, the plane lurched to the right, caught in another crosswind. Emily didn't hesitate. She corrected it immediately, pushing the plane back into line. Every movement, every action now felt like a matter of life or death. Sweat poured down her face, but she never stopped. The passengers, gripped by fear, were holding their breath, their eyes wide in disbelief. Even Daniel, now fully aware of the danger they were in, seemed to be holding on to the moment with an almost reverential awe. And then, with the runway rapidly approaching, Emily gave one final pull on the controls, expertly guiding the plane in for the landing. The wheels hit the runway with a jarring force, the thud reverberating throughout the cabin. The entire plane shuddered with the impact, and the brakes engaged with a sudden screech that rattled their bones. Emily pushed forward on the throttle to engage reverse thrust, and the plane began to decelerate, the runway slipping beneath them. With every passing second, the plane slowed, and the passengers collectively held their breath. And then, finally, the plane came to a stop. The deafening roar of the wind was replaced by an eerie silence. The storm was still raging, but they were on the ground. For a few long seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. The reality of what had just happened was still sinking in. But then, as if on cue, the plane erupted with applause. The passengers, who had been so terrified moments ago, now cheered, their relief palpable. Tears flowed, laughter bubbled up, and the tension that had filled the cabin for so long evaporated in an instant. Emily Carson sat in the cockpit, her hands still gripping the controls. She didn't move immediately, her breath coming in shallow, exhausted gasps. Her body was drained, her mind numb from the intense concentration. But she had done it. She had landed the plane. The silence inside the Cessna 208 was deafening. It wasn't the eerie, unsettling silence of an uncertain fate, but the palpable quiet that followed the overwhelming release of tension. Emily Carson's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing to catch up with what had just transpired. Her hands, still gripping the controls with a quiet intensity, slowly relaxed. Her breath came in uneven gasps as the reality of the situation began to settle in. The rain was still hammering against the windows, but the turbulence had ceased. The plane was on the ground. They had made it. For a long moment, no one moved. No one dared speak. The passengers, those who had been clinging to life just moments before, remained frozen in place, as if afraid to break the fragile peace that had descended upon them. But then, as if the tension could no longer be contained, it erupted in a cacophony of sound. Applause. Shouts of relief. A few passengers even wept openly, their eyes wide with disbelief that they had survived. Emily allowed herself a small, tired smile, but she didn't allow herself to celebrate just yet. There was still so much to do. The plane was safely on the runway, but the emergency services were already roaring toward them, their flashing lights cutting through the storm. She still had to taxi the plane to a safe spot, ensure the passengers were deplaned, and help manage the chaos that would surely follow. But for now, the most important thing was that they had made it. The control tower came through the radio once again, their voice cutting through the static. Cessna 208, you've made a perfect landing. Emergency services are en route. Please maintain your current position until they arrive. You've done an outstanding job, Captain. Her hands still trembling from the exertion, Emily keyed the mic, her voice steady as always. Copy that. Thank you. The plane's engines idled, a hum that felt strangely comforting after the chaos that had just unfolded. Emily allowed herself a brief moment to collect her thoughts, exhaling slowly. The adrenaline that had kept her sharp through the entire ordeal began to fade, leaving behind a deep exhaustion. She could feel her muscles aching, her mind struggling to stay focused. It wasn't until she saw the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles through the rain-soaked windows that she allowed herself to release the tight grip she had on her composure. One by one, the passengers began to stand up, some of them still in shock, others unable to hold back their tears. A few of them moved toward the front, making their way to the cockpit, eager to thank the woman who had saved their lives. Daniel Ford, the businessman who had spent the entire flight mocking her, was one of the first. He approached her slowly, his face pale, his features drawn. The brash confidence he had carried with him when he had boarded the flight was completely gone, replaced with a deep respect. It was as if the events of the past hour had stripped him of every ounce of arrogance and left him standing in front of her, humble, thankful, and, most of all, grateful. Emily met his gaze, her expression unchanged, though her heart beat a little faster at the sight of him standing before her. She had no time for ego or pride. She was here to do her job, and she had done it. "Captain Carson," Daniel began, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. You saved our lives. I didn't think you could do it. I didn't believe in you, and I'm so sorry. What you did back there, it was nothing short of miraculous. I never should have judged you." Emily could see the sincerity in his eyes, the deep regret that now filled his voice. His posture was slumped, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his words. She could tell he meant every one of them. She took a deep breath, her fatigue settling in, but her voice still strong. "You don't need to apologize," she replied. "I'm just doing my job. I don't need praise for that. What matters is that we all made it. We're safe." Daniel nodded, his face a mixture of gratitude and shame. "You're right. You didn't ask for this, but you gave us all a chance. And I can't thank you enough." The words were simple, but they were enough. The apology had been made, and the respect had been earned. But Emily didn't need that kind of validation. What mattered now was that the storm was over, and everyone on that plane was alive. That was the only victory she needed. As Daniel stepped back to rejoin the others, Emily felt a sense of relief wash over her. The passengers were safe. The plane had made it down, and now, the emergency services were taking over. Her part in the story was over. The weight of what had just happened slowly began to sink in. But the exhaustion in her bones and the pounding in her head made it hard to process. She closed her eyes for just a moment, leaning back in her seat. She had faced down one of the worst storms of her life, both literally and figuratively. The raw, brutal power of nature had tried to take control, but she had fought back. Her training, her will, everything she had learned in her years as a fighter pilot had come together to bring them safely through. It wasn't just about flying. It was about resilience, about never giving up, even when the odds were against her. The passengers were still filing out of the plane, many of them stopping to offer their thanks. A few had taken out their phones to record video, eager to document the incredible story of survival that would soon be told. Emily didn't mind. She had already made peace with the fact that her actions would be shared with the world. But she didn't need recognition. She didn't need to be seen as a hero. What mattered was that she had done her job. As she finally unstrapped herself from the seat and stood, her body protesting the movement, Emily glanced once more at the people who had been depending on her. They were safe now, and that was all she had ever wanted. The doors opened, and the air outside was still thick with the storm's wrath, but Emily stepped out of the plane, stepping into the pouring rain. She didn't look back as she made her way toward the emergency vehicles, her shoulders squared, her mind already moving to the next task. She had saved lives today. But for Emily Carson, it was just another day on the job. The buzz of excitement inside the airport terminal grew louder by the minute. News reporters, camera crews, and photographers had descended upon Carson City Municipal Airport like a swarm of bees, eager to capture every detail of the miraculous landing and its heroine, Captain Emily Carson. Emergency services had already secured the area, and the passengers had been safely escorted off the plane, each of them visibly shaken but overwhelmingly grateful. But now, it was Emily's turn to face the media frenzy. As she stepped off the plane, her boots sinking slightly into the wet pavement, the chill of the storm was nothing compared to the weight of the attention she was about to receive. She had always been a private person, preferring the quiet solitude of the cockpit to the glare of public scrutiny. But today, she knew that the eyes of the world were on her. The news of her heroic actions had already spread like wildfire, reaching social media platforms, news outlets, and every corner of the country. "Captain Carson," one reporter shouted as Emily approached the airport building. "How do you feel about what you've accomplished today?" Emily paused, her hand brushing the wet strands of hair away from her face as she turned toward the voice. The sea of reporters surrounding her was a blur, their microphones and cameras trained on her, awaiting her response. She felt a pang of discomfort, but she had learned long ago how to remain composed under pressure. She smiled, though it was a small, tired curve of her lips, and spoke into the nearest microphone. "I didn't accomplish anything special," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I did what I was trained to do. My job is to keep people safe, and that's what I did today." The words were simple, but they carried the gravity of the situation. She didn't need accolades. She didn't need to be celebrated. The only thing that mattered to her was that the passengers were alive. But she knew that wouldn't be enough for the reporters. They were looking for a story, for a narrative to spin, and Emily was at the center of it. "Can you walk us through what happened on the flight?" another reporter pressed. "What was going through your mind when the storm hit? When the plane was struck by lightning?" Emily's eyes flickered briefly toward the sky, the storm still raging in the distance. She could still hear the crack of thunder in her ears, feel the tremble of the plane as it was rocked by the fierce winds and rain. But she couldn't let herself be swept up in the memory. She had to stay grounded. "There wasn't time to think," she answered, her gaze unwavering. "When something like that happens, you react. You don't waste time thinking about the storm, or the lightning, or the fear. You focus on the task at hand, on getting the plane back under control." The reporters nodded, scribbling notes, their cameras capturing every word. Emily was growing more exhausted by the minute. The adrenaline that had carried her through the crisis was starting to wear off, replaced by a deep, bone-weary fatigue. But she pushed it aside. There were still people to thank, still details to address. The world didn't stop for exhaustion. "You were able to land the plane without any casualties," a voice broke in, this time from a man with a camera crew at his side. "What do you think made the difference? What was it that allowed you to pull off such a difficult and dangerous landing?" Emily paused before responding, her mind momentarily lost in the memory of those final minutes, of the plane's shaking descent, of the moments when it seemed like they might not make it, the sheer terror that had filled the cabin, the quiet whispers of doubt and fear from the passengers. But then, there had been that moment when she knew. She had known with absolute certainty that they were going to make it. The training, the preparation, the resilience. It all came together in that single, decisive moment. "I think it was the training," she said simply, her eyes scanning the crowd, her gaze briefly landing on Daniel Ford, who was standing off to the side, watching her with a look of awe. "It's not about how much you want it, or how much you hope for it. It's about being prepared. When you've put in the work, when you've prepared for the worst, you can face anything. That's what got us through. And that's what kept us all safe." There was a quiet shift in the crowd as her words sank in. Emily hadn't given them a story to embellish, but what she had given them was far more valuable. A glimpse into the character of a true leader. She wasn't the person they wanted her to be, the hero the media so desperately sought. But she was, undeniably, the person who would save their lives. As the interview continued, Emily could feel the energy of the crowd begin to shift. The initial buzz had been about her miraculous landing, but now, as the story of her humility and composure began to spread, the admiration in the room grew. It was no longer just about the storm or the plane. It was about the woman who had faced down both and come out victorious, not with a boastful victory speech, but with grace and quiet strength. The media storm wasn't the only thing shifting. Emily could see the ripple effect in the way people were looking at her now, including Daniel Ford, the businessman who had once doubted her every move. He was standing a little straighter now, his expression no longer that of a man looking down at someone beneath him, but a man who had come to realize just how wrong he had been. As the questions slowly began to wind down, the reporters made their way toward the airport terminal to file their stories, leaving Emily alone for a moment. She took a deep breath, allowing herself a brief moment of respite before she had to face the next wave of attention. But she wasn't ready to leave just yet. Daniel approached her quietly, stepping into her line of sight. His face was still pale, but the look in his eyes was different, full of respect, admiration, and something deeper. Something that went beyond mere gratitude. "You were incredible," he said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. "What you did, the way you handled everything. I don't know if I could have done it. I've never seen anything like that. You saved all of us. And I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. For doubting you." Emily regarded him for a moment, her expression softening. It wasn't the apology that mattered to her. It was the shift in his perception. She wasn't just a woman in uniform anymore. She was a leader. A hero, yes. But more importantly, she was someone who had been given the opportunity to prove herself, and she had done so, without hesitation. "You don't need to apologize," she said simply, her tone warm but firm. "We're all just doing our best. We're all capable of more than we think, even when it seems impossible. Just remember that the next time you see someone who might not fit your idea of what a leader looks like." Daniel nodded, his eyes full of understanding. He stepped back, giving her the space she needed, but not without one last look of respect. Emily felt a small wave of satisfaction, but it wasn't for herself. It was for the moment, for the shift in people's perceptions, for the proof that anyone, no matter their gender, their background, their appearance, was capable of extraordinary things. And as the media frenzy slowly calmed and the storm continued to rage outside, Emily Carson finally allowed herself to feel the weight of the day's events. She wasn't a hero. She was a pilot. And that was all she needed to be. The news cycle had exploded. Emily Carson's story was everywhere. Headlines on every major news outlet. Social media flooded with hashtags bearing her name. The fearless pilot who had defied the storm, saved a plane full of passengers, and silenced the doubters who had questioned her from the start. Her face, calm and steady in the midst of chaos, had become a symbol, a beacon of strength, resilience, and the power of preparation. The coverage was relentless. Journalists, bloggers, and influencers all tried to get their piece of the story, each eager to share their own version of the hero's journey. Emily had known that her actions would draw attention, but the sheer scale of it caught her off guard. As the days passed, her phone buzzed nonstop with interview requests, invitations to speak at conferences, and offers for appearances. Even companies that specialized in aviation technology wanted to partner with her, using her newfound fame to promote their products. Emily knew how the game worked. She had seen it before. Heroes were made in moments of crisis, but often, the media didn't care about the real story. They cared about the image, the narrative. She wasn't interested in the spotlight. She wasn't interested in being turned into a symbol. But she couldn't deny the impact her actions were having on the broader conversation. The conversation, however, wasn't just about the heroic landing. It wasn't just about the storm. It was about something deeper, something more profound. The fact that a woman, a military pilot, had stepped up in the face of an almost impossible challenge and saved the lives of so many people struck a chord with people across the nation. It sparked a conversation about gender, about women in leadership positions, and about how society often underestimated them. Women everywhere were sharing Emily's story, using it as fuel to challenge the biases they faced in their own lives. Emily had become, unwillingly, a role model. She was the face of resilience, of the unacknowledged power of women in a male-dominated world. And while she didn't want the fame, she couldn't help but recognize that this moment was about something more important than her personal discomfort. This was a moment of change. This was a chance to open the door for others who would come after her. Women in aviation, women in the military, women everywhere who were still fighting to be taken seriously, still fighting to prove they were just as capable as anyone else. The media coverage became more intense. Public appearances followed, but Emily found herself growing more and more uncomfortable. Each interview felt like another layer of armor she had to put on. Each question was a reminder that she was no longer just Emily Carson, the pilot. She was Emily Carson, the national hero. The weight of that title pressed on her shoulders, and it was hard to ignore the pressure. Despite the growing pressure, Emily remained grounded. She never let the attention get to her head. Every time a reporter or an influencer asked her about her heroics, she kept her answers simple, to the point. It wasn't about her, it was about the passengers she had saved, the training that had prepared her, and the team that had supported her. But the narrative wasn't always so simple. The press painted her as the sole figure in the storm, the lone soldier who had defied the odds and triumphed. And as the media machine continued to churn, Emily couldn't help but feel like a cog in a machine that didn't care about the complexities of the real story. But there was one moment in particular that stood out, an invitation to a major news show. It was the biggest platform she had been offered yet, and she knew that her presence there would solidify her place in the national conversation. The host of the show, a respected figure in the media world, was well known for her probing questions, her ability to dissect a story down to its core. As the cameras rolled, the host smiled warmly at Emily. "Captain Carson," she began, "your story has captured the imagination of millions. You've been called a hero, a role model, a trailblazer for women in aviation. But I have to ask, how does it feel to be put on such a pedestal?" Emily sat up straighter, the familiar discomfort creeping back in. She had been waiting for a question like this, the question that would demand a response about what it meant to be a symbol. "It feels overwhelming," Emily replied slowly, her voice calm but her eyes betraying a hint of the fatigue that had been building up. "I never set out to be a symbol. I never wanted to be anyone's idea of a hero. I just did what I was trained to do. I reacted in the moment. I didn't think about fame or recognition. I thought about the lives on that plane and what I had to do to keep them safe." The host nodded, clearly impressed, but she pressed on. "But the truth is, Captain, you are a symbol now. You've become a voice for so many women who feel like they don't have the opportunities, the recognition, or the respect they deserve. Do you think that your actions, in this moment, can change how women are seen in leadership positions?" Emily took a deep breath. This was the question she had been dreading, the question that would demand more than a simple answer. "I hope so," she said after a pause. "I hope that my actions can show people what we're capable of. But it's not just about me. It's about the women who are working every day, in every field, to prove themselves. It's about breaking down the stereotypes, the biases, the walls that hold women back. I can't change the world overnight, but if my story encourages one person to believe in themselves a little more, to push a little harder, then I've done something worth doing." The host smiled, clearly moved by her response. The interview wrapped up, but as Emily left the studio, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting in her. She had never wanted to be a leader or an icon. But if her story was going to be the catalyst for change, if it was going to help other women see their potential, then maybe, just maybe, it was worth it. Back in the quiet of her home that night, Emily sat on the edge of her bed, looking out at the city lights that flickered beyond her window. The storm had passed, and life was slowly returning to normal. But she knew she would never be the same. Her world had expanded, her impact had grown. She was now a part of something much bigger than herself. And even though she had never wanted the spotlight, she realized that in this moment, she had the chance to make a real difference. And for the first time, Emily Carson allowed herself to feel something more than exhaustion. She felt a sense of purpose. The weeks that followed Emily's heroic landing were a whirlwind. Her phone buzzed day and night. Emails flooded in from every corner of the country, and interviews seemed to be scheduled on an endless loop. As the media cycle continued to revolve around her story, Emily found herself retreating further into the quiet, familiar spaces of her life. She had always been someone who preferred the background, the one who worked diligently without seeking recognition. But now, with every passing day, she was more than just a pilot. She was an icon, a symbol of what was possible when people broke through their limits, when they defied expectations. Emily spent hours reflecting on everything that had led to that moment in the sky. Her training, the long years of military service, the endless hours spent in simulations, the scrupulous attention to detail that had once seemed tedious, now felt invaluable. She had been ready, even when the world wasn't. It was in those moments, the ones that tested her resolve, that Emily realized just how much her training had shaped her. But what the media didn't talk about, what no one seemed to realize, was the deep internal work she had done, the years of pushing through not just physical barriers, but emotional and psychological ones. The crash landing, though extraordinary, wasn't what had changed her. The true change had come in the aftermath, the way her heart had begun to open up, the way she saw herself differently in the light of the stories, the messages from people who had watched her action and now looked up to her. The letters of gratitude from families of passengers, the messages from women everywhere, thanking her for showing them that they, too, could rise above fear and doubt. They were humbling, they were emotional, and they made her uncomfortable, because in her mind, she had simply done her job. The fact that it had become something larger than that, something that transcended her as an individual, had left her grappling with what it meant for her future. She had always kept her emotions close to her chest, hidden behind the cool and calculated demeanor of an Air Force officer. But now, she found herself looking at the world differently. She saw it not just as a place of duty, of strict rules and boundaries, but as a place where real change could happen. She could be that change. Emily's heroic actions had sparked something deep within her, something she hadn't fully realized until now. One evening, after a particularly exhausting series of interviews, Emily found herself sitting at a small cafe on the edge of town. It was a quiet place, with dim lighting and soft music playing in the background, her sanctuary from the constant media frenzy. She had been trying to take a break, to simply breathe and be herself again. But even in this quiet space, the world outside was impossible to escape. A man sat down at the table next to hers. He was in his late 40s, wearing a suit that looked like it had seen better days, his eyes tired but kind. He offered a warm smile as he noticed her sitting alone, and, after a beat, he spoke. "You're Captain Carson, right?" Emily looked up, instinctively putting up her guard. She had learned long ago to expect this kind of recognition, but she had hoped for just a few more minutes of peace. "I am," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "I just wanted to say," the man continued, his voice calm and respectful, "that what you did was incredible. You saved lives. And that doesn't get enough recognition, especially for someone like you." She raised an eyebrow. "Someone like me?" The man nodded. "A woman. A military officer. We don't always get the same kind of credit, do we?" The world's still catching up to that reality. Emily hadn't expected this kind of conversation. Genuine, unpretentious. She had been bracing herself for the usual barrage of accolades, but this was different. She saw in this man's eyes something she hadn't fully understood about herself, that her actions were part of a larger narrative, one that could change the course of her career, but more importantly, change the way society viewed women in leadership positions. He wasn't just acknowledging her skills as a pilot. He was recognizing the systemic biases that often went unnoticed. A moment of silence passed between them, and then Emily spoke, her voice quieter now, her tone reflective. "I never thought about it that way," she confessed. "I never thought about how what I do could influence anything beyond my job. I just wanted to do it well. But now I see it's about more than that. It's about setting an example. It's about showing that women can do this, too. That we don't have to apologize for taking up space." The man smiled, nodding thoughtfully. "Exactly. And maybe that's the real impact of what you did. It wasn't just a successful emergency landing. It was a moment where you showed everyone what was possible. And it's not just about aviation. It's about changing the way we view leadership, the way we view people." As Emily sat there, she felt something stir deep within her. It wasn't a sense of pride. Not yet. It was something deeper, something more profound. She had always been a soldier, a professional. But now, she was starting to see the possibility of her story being more than just a personal victory. It was a call to action. A call for women to step into their power, to take their place as equals, to show up and stand tall, regardless of the obstacles. For so long, Emily had defined herself by the rules, the boundaries of her profession. But now, as she looked around at the people who were impacted by her story, she understood something more. She wasn't just breaking rules, she was creating new ones. Rules that didn't rely on gender, race, or preconceived notions of capability. Rules that allowed space for everyone to be seen and heard. She had begun to reflect on her future, on the path she would take after this moment. She knew her career in aviation was far from over, but she also knew she had a responsibility to something greater now. She could no longer stay in the background, quietly serving her country. She could no longer pretend that her voice didn't matter. It was time to use it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing. Another interview request. Another invitation. But this time, it didn't feel like a burden. This time, Emily knew that she could choose how she engaged with this new role. She could take up space. She could speak her truth. "I have to go," she said, standing up from the table. "But thank you for reminding me of what this is really about." The man nodded. "Good luck, Captain. We're all behind you." As Emily left the cafe, her mind raced with possibilities. She wasn't just a pilot anymore. She was a catalyst for change. And the journey ahead was one she was ready to embrace, not as a symbol, but as a force, quietly powerful, grounded in purpose, and ready to lead. The months that followed Emily's heroic landing were a blur of activity. She continued to navigate the media storm with the same grace and humility that had defined her throughout her life. But now, every appearance, every interview, and every public engagement felt different. She wasn't just responding to the questions that came her way. She was shaping the conversation, guiding it in a direction that mattered. She had become more than just a pilot. She had become a symbol, a voice for change in a world that was still figuring out how to give women the space they deserved. Emily spent less time in the cockpit, her career in aviation taking on new dimensions. She had become a sought-after speaker at leadership conferences, advocating for greater representation of women in traditionally male-dominated fields. She wasn't just telling people about her experience in the storm anymore. She was telling them how they could break through their own barriers, how they could face down fear and come out the other side stronger. The work was exhausting. The schedules were grueling. But there was a sense of fulfillment that came with it. Every time she spoke to a group of young women, whether it was a class of aspiring pilots or a group of professionals working in corporate environments, she felt a deep sense of purpose. She was no longer just telling her own story. She was part of a much larger narrative, one that involved breaking down walls, challenging assumptions, and rewriting the rules of what it meant to lead. And yet, for all the attention, for all the praise and the media coverage, Emily never lost sight of what mattered most to her: the lives of those passengers on that plane. She still kept in touch with many of them, receiving thank you cards, letters, and messages from people who had been on board that fateful flight. Their words were always the same: gratitude, admiration, and a sense of awe. They didn't just thank her for landing the plane. They thanked her for showing them what real leadership looked like, for demonstrating what it meant to stay calm under pressure, to act decisively when it counted. It wasn't long before Emily's story became a case study in leadership. It was used in universities, taught in military academies, and cited in articles about overcoming adversity. Her name was mentioned in boardrooms, and her image was often displayed as a powerful example of what it meant to rise to the occasion, no matter the odds. But even with all the accolades, Emily never let it go to her head. She never allowed herself to become complacent. She knew that the work she had done, the story she had lived, wasn't just a chapter in her own life. It was part of a larger movement, a movement that transcended individual achievements. As time passed, Emily's legacy began to take root in ways she hadn't imagined. New initiatives were created to support women in aviation, military service, and other male-dominated industries. Scholarships for women who wanted to pursue careers in flight were established in her name. Organizations dedicated to promoting diversity and inclusion in leadership roles reached out to her for partnerships. Emily had become a catalyst for an entire generation of women who were ready to take the world by storm. But even as the world celebrated her, Emily remained deeply connected to the reasons she had become a pilot in the first place: the love of flight, the sense of duty, and the desire to serve. Despite the constant buzz of activity and the ever-expanding circle of influence she had, she knew that her roots would always lie in the sky. It was there, in the solitude of the cockpit, that she found her true self, the part of her that needed no validation, no applause, just the open air and the feeling of being in control. One quiet evening, as Emily sat at home, reflecting on all that had transpired, she received a phone call that changed everything. "Captain Carson," the voice on the other end said, "it's Colonel Daniels from the Pentagon. We'd like to offer you a position as a senior advisor for the Department of Defense's Diversity and Inclusion Initiative. Your experience, your leadership, your advocacy, everything you've done has made a lasting impact. We believe you're the right person to help shape the future of military leadership." The offer stunned Emily. It wasn't just another speaking engagement or a partnership deal. This was an opportunity to effect real change at the highest levels. It was a chance to bring her message of leadership, equality, and resilience to the very institutions that had shaped her career. After a long pause, Emily responded, her voice steady, but tinged with emotion. "I'd be honored. I've always believed that leadership should reflect the people it serves, and this is an opportunity to make sure that happens. Thank you." As she hung up the phone, Emily sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the weight of the decision she had just made. It was a new chapter, one that would stretch her beyond her comfort zone, beyond the skies she had known so well. But she was ready for it. She had come so far, faced so many challenges, and grown in ways she never thought possible. Now, it was time to take her message of empowerment and leadership to the next level. Her story had begun with a single, life-or-death moment in the sky, but it was far from over. She had become a beacon, a source of inspiration for women and men alike. A legacy of courage, of resilience, of breaking through barriers. Emily Carson's name would be remembered for generations to come, not just as a pilot who saved lives, but as a leader who changed the course of history. In the years that followed, her work at the Department of Defense helped to usher in a new era of leadership, one that embraced diversity, equity, and inclusion. She pushed for policies that would make the military and other institutions more accessible to women and minorities, advocating for equal opportunities in recruitment, training, and promotion. She worked tirelessly to dismantle the systemic biases that had held so many back, ensuring that every person, regardless of gender or background, would have the chance to rise to the highest levels of leadership. As Emily stood in front of a group of young cadets, delivering her final speech before retiring from active duty, she knew that her journey had come full circle. She had fought for change, for justice, and for equality. She had shown the world that leadership wasn't about who you were, it was about what you could do. And she had done it. She had risen above it all. She glanced out at the sea of faces before her, faces filled with determination, hope, and the promise of a new future. A future where they would lead with courage, with humility, and with the same strength that she had shown on that fateful day when the storm had come. And as she walked away from the podium, she felt a deep sense of peace. She had done her part. Now, it was their turn. The legacy of Emily Carson, the pilot who saved a plane, the woman who inspired a movement, would live on forever. Emily Carson's journey had begun as a simple story of survival, a pilot in the right place at the right time, using her training to save lives in the face of overwhelming odds. But what began as a harrowing flight through storm clouds had transformed into something far greater than anyone could have anticipated. It had evolved into a powerful narrative of resilience, leadership, and the quiet strength found in breaking barriers. Through every interview, every speech, and every moment of reflection, Emily had come to realize that her legacy was not just about what she had done in the cockpit, but what she had sparked in the hearts of others. She had become a symbol, not of extraordinary feats in the air, but of the everyday courage it took to step forward, to lead, and to challenge the world's assumptions about who could lead. Her life was no longer just a story of one woman's triumph. It was a story of millions, of the potential waiting to be unlocked in those who were ready to take flight, metaphorically or literally. It was a reminder that no matter where you came from, no matter what obstacles stood in your way, the capacity for greatness lived within everyone. You just had to be willing to take that first step, to rise above fear, and to soar. As Emily looked toward the horizon, she knew the future would continue to bring challenges, new storms, new hurdles, new moments that would test her. But she was ready. She had faced the storm before, and she would face it again. Not as a symbol, but as a woman whose purpose had been reshaped by the lives she had touched and the legacy she had built. In the end, Emily Carson's story was not just one of courage in a moment of crisis, but one of hope. A hope that, through determination, compassion, and a relentless belief in what was possible, the world could be changed for the better, one person at a time. And that was the true power of her legacy. Thank you so much for sticking with us and listening to the entire journey of Emily Carson. We truly appreciate your time and attention as we've walked through this inspiring story of courage, leadership, and breaking barriers. We hope that Emily's journey has touched your heart and left you with a sense of empowerment and possibility. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with friends who might need a little inspiration today. Your support means the world to us and helps us bring more amazing stories like this one to life. Make sure to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you again for watching, and we look forward to sharing more stories with you in the future. Stay strong, stay inspired, and keep soaring high.